Hey everyone, and today's video I want to talk about a topic that I've been thinking a lot about, and that is the role that sewing can play in our mental health. And there's a lot of different perspectives about that, but in today's video I want to share my thoughts about it and how I find sewing been really helpful when I've had some curveballs thrown at me and some general life struggles. When it comes to my own mental health, I would say that the thing that I do struggle with is anxiety. I don't really have like a lot of full-blown panic attacks, but I'm definitely familiar with having like a low level anxiety that rears its ugly head, especially if I have a lot of uncertainties in my life, or I have a lot of like bottle up emotions that I've not really been able to deal with. That's usually where anxiety starts to really affect me. And the thing about sewing that I find really helpful when I get those bouts of anxiety is that it's just such a concentrating pursuit, because I can just it's very narrow. I don't really have to be all over the place. Instead, I can focus on a very singular thing, and I can really delve into that and really lose myself for a lot of hours without feeling distracted from other things around me. Because a lot of other things I find that I can be really distracted, especially in times of these when you have so much going on inside your cell phone, which can definitely really get you off track. But when I sew, I definitely lose track of all that sort of constant checking. So I do find that also helps me, really shield out a lot of things that otherwise would have triggered my anxiety. So that's one of the things that I find sewing being really helpful for. And also, in general, if I go through a rough time, say with family related stuff, relationships, health, all that stuff, I do find that having sewing as a form of distraction also is super helpful. It's like a crutch in a way, but a really beautiful crutch, as in I know that sewing is always there for me, and luckily I have not yet felt, I've never been in a place in my life where I felt that I have not have the energy to sew. I know that can happen as well, depending, say, if you have a depression, for instance. But at least for me, I've always find, some type of motivation to sew, and that just keeps me going, because again, I find that the valuable thing about sewing is that it's just you can basically really immerse yourself in the process. You can achieve a flow. There's no type of distractions. I mean, I can go into that bubble for hours, sometimes a bit too long, which causes some mistakes, which I've talked about in other videos. But that is also one of the gifts about sewing, and also it's such a tangible result, because sometimes I feel in today's society there's so many things that we do that don't really have a tangible result. That can be both in our day jobs and in other things that we do. But sewing, there's a very specific process, and you start with an idea and then you work with very tactile materials, and you can see how from that, fabrics and tissue paper, all of a sudden you can start to see how a garment is shaping. And to me, still, that is some type of magic. And my anxiety is also related to being productive. In Sweden, we have a word for this. It's usually called accomplishment anxiety. I don't know if you have that in other languages. I really like to know that, but it's basically a sort of anxiety that keeps you always wanting to do more things, being validated by what you do rather than who you are. And of course, that is probably not a very healthy mindset, but if I have that sort of anxiety, I do find that being productive with sewing actually helps me reduce that anxiety, because there are lots of other ways that I think is way less healthy if you have that sort of accomplishment anxiety than to just sew. So I definitely find that that's really helpful as well, because I will say that I do enjoy being productive, and I don't want to get rid of that aspect of my anxiety, if that makes sense, but I definitely want to have it in healthy ways. So that's why I do find that sewing really stimulates my need to be accomplished in a way that I find really healthy and not really so dependent on validation from other people, which is something that I do feel that I'm a little bit addicted to, like I think most of us are. But for me, sewing can be like a very personal pursuit. Even though I share things, I do find that the biggest satisfaction for me is the one that I get myself. And I also think that sewing can have a preventive effect on how we feel and our moods. One thing that I do think is super valuable about having a hobby, regardless of what it is that it's your own space. And oftentimes we can be felt really pulled in many different directions. I think that a lot of us often feels that maybe we are doing a lot of things for everyone else and perhaps not always making priority of ourselves. And that's why I think sewing is such a great thing to have, or any other type of hobby as well, because that's a very dedicated time where it's about you and your needs, which is also one of the reasons I'm not really fond of sewing too much for other people, because it's such a personal time for me where I need to be myself and express my creativity. Which also brings me to another point. I think having a creative pursuit is also really, really important when it comes to preventive measurements for your own mental health, because being able to create things, it's such a validating skill to have. And I do think that my life would be a lot poorer if I didn't have sewing as my way of expressing myself. I do have other ways as well, but sewing is probably the one that has been most consistent throughout my life, because I think it's so multifaceted, and also it's also validating because I keep learning new things and I keep growing, which again I think is really important for our mental health and our beliefs in ourselves and our confidence. So again, I think sewing can be super valuable when it comes to how we feel. Now, sewing can be quite a lonely pursuit, but thankfully, because we have these arenas now to meet, we can meet from all over the world and share our common interest, help each other, share each other on, give feedback, just being encouragement and inspiration. And that to me is also super valuable. And I do find that I'm much more motivated these days to make things, and that I do feel because I'm part of a community. And even though I am sewing by myself most of the time, I still feel that I'm not really sewing alone, because I can share my experience with you guys, and that really means a lot. The downside, I do think, and that's something I want to address as well, is that also because there's so much sharing now, and we always like to, share a highlight reel, right? I do think that there's also a darker side, which actually can trigger anxiety, I think, because there's a lot of dangers, I think, in comparing oneself too much, because especially on Instagram, again, I keep coming back to that, but I do think that because that is such a narrow part of the whole sewing process that most of us see in the feed. Stories, of course, are a little bit more revealing, but again, when you just look at someone's feed, you will always see, the best parts, the best angle. So that's basically the nature of Instagram, and I don't really think that will change. I definitely am one of those myself, because I do think that is really what sort of suits Instagram in a way. It's a bit hard to explain, but I think you know what I mean. Whereas I'm also very glad that I do have my YouTube channel and my blog where I can talk about other things, which also pertains to sewing, because the reality of sewing process is that it can also be incredibly messy. It can be frustrating. It can be riddled with mistakes, struggles. You don't always feel that great about every little step, and sometimes, of course, you can feel a bit self-conscious about your result compared to what others might have had. So that's what I think is really important to remember, that what we see is the finished project, and that can be the result of either good angle or hours of ripping and re-sewing, which is definitely the case of me, because I do try to make my things look really good, but I also rip a lot if I'm not happy. So there's definitely a lot of time spent that goes on behind the scenes, which I think is really important to communicate so you don't really forget it. So that's always good to have in mind and to talk about and keep that discussion going. That's also why I make videos about my own learning journey, my mistakes, and I don't want to position myself as someone who doesn't ever make mistakes, because that is so far from the truth, and I hope no one thinks that that's the case. But yeah, of course, I do like to make things look good, but I also want to make sure that I share what goes on behind the scene, because that is so valuable to mitigate, I think, the issue that it can sort of happen now, because you have this this very gorgeous, beautiful visual communication system, which is called Instagram, basically, that kind of skews our image of sewing. So definitely something that I think we all need to remind ourselves, and I definitely struggle with that myself from time to time. So yeah, there are all different aspects, but bringing back to my original point, I think with that said, I'm so incredibly happy that I've had sewing in my life, and I think that if I hadn't had sewing in my life, I definitely think that would have struggled a lot more. And I say that confidently because I do feel that having that outlet always to rely on, and knowing that it's also something that I'm good at and something that I can improve on as well, it just gives me a sense of, how should I put it, security. I think security is a good word, and also, you know, being able to have this as my space in my life, and that's super valuable. So this is my story around sewing and mental health, and if you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear your experience with this as well. I do think that a lot of us find a lot of comfort in having this wonderful hobby, to have our sort of happy place, even though sometimes it frustrates us as well. And I do think it's so important to talk about this stuff, because a lot of causes, I think, around the stigma around mental health is that we still feel a little bit hesitant about talking about it, probably because we're a little bit scared about how it will be perceived, and also perhaps a fear about vulnerability. But I can say that every time I talk about my mental health state, which I do a lot in my personal life, because I do find it's really helpful, is that being open about it can actually lift some of that heavy lid as well, just being able to express it in some way, so like I've done in this video, for instance. So yeah, I do think it's very important that we have this conversation going, and also lift those positive ways that we can actually help ourselves feeling a bit better. And I do think that sewing is one of those ways. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and